So welcome back to Mountain Ridge Church. I know this week is Thanksgiving week, and whatever your plans are, I hope that you're able to enjoy God. I hope that you're able to enjoy family. So again, this week, be safe. I hope you have a wonderful Turkey Day. So we're going to continue walking through this series called Redeemed and Forgiven. And I'm just going to start with today's talk and just say, life's not easy, right? Like you've discovered this already, right? And so when life gets hard, when life gets kind of messy, what do we do when our relationships get messy, whenever there's hurts we can't overcome because life's hard? What do we normally do in those situations? Well, we think about ourselves. Don't we all do that? It's very normal. We just have this tendency to go inward. We think about how hard life is, and we tend to think about how unfair life is. And secretly, don't we kind of look at others and compare our lives to their lives? We look at their life and we think, man, their life is so easy. We look at our life and we think, man, our lives are so hard. We have so many challenges to go through. We just have this natural, normal way of going inward, right? And we have this way of thinking, well, life's about me right now. And when we focus on ourselves, what happens to your emotions? What happens to you? I'll tell you what happens to me. Sometimes our emotions kind of just get sad, right? So when something bad happens and something messy happens, we start focusing on ourselves and our emotions follow, right? We tend to kind of get sad. We tend to kind of get depressed. And I don't know about you, but sometimes people feel like they're walking through mud. It feels like they're waist deep in mud. It can feel really hard. It can feel like a huge challenge. And in their minds, they're looping, right? They're looping in negative thoughts. They're looping in negative emotions. They begin to loop in all the things that people may have said or not said. And some people even loop in all the bad things that might go bad in the future. Are you one of them? There are a lot of people who lose a lot of sleep. They can't go to sleep because their minds are just looping with all the bad things that might happen in the future, right? Again, when bad things happen or there's a struggle or relationship messes, what do? Well, we tend to go inward. We start to focus on ourselves. And again, we just begin to loop in these things. It's very normal. It happens to me. I can be driving in my car and the dashboard light lights up saying check engine, and it just ticks me off. I know now there's so many other things that I have to do. There's phone calls I have to make. I have to rearrange, who's going to drive what car. Emails are stacking up, text messages, voice messages, and I begin to think, when am I going to get all this done? And in those moments, I begin to think about me. I begin to think about my challenges. I have a cavity to take care of. I have a transmission in a van that blew up. I have to get the oil changed in another car. I have a kid to try to get through college. And by the way, I have to buy a used car to replace the other car, right? And did I mention, now I have a second kid who wants to go to college, and my truck has rust on it, not to mention the COVID numbers are on an increase. How do we know what the COVID numbers are? Are they real? Are they not real? We really don't know. What does it mean to us in our town? Don't know. What does it mean to us at school? Don't know. What does it mean to us at church? Don't know. And so all these things begin to mount, right? Like, can you connect with this at home? All these things begin to mount up on us, like layer and layer, and it's like an avalanche of issues, right? And when you feel that avalanche of issues, again, we can go inward, we feel sad, and we can feel frozen, almost defeated. And as we feel this emotional avalanche pouring out on us, we can feel smaller and smaller. It can make us feel a little overwhelmed. When this happens, like I said, we tend to look inward. It can make us feel tired. It can make us feel sad, depressed. And what does the world tell us to do? Well, the world tells us focus on yourself more. Like more me time, more vacation time, more downtime, more Netflix binge time, more game time. Like focus on yourself more. The counselors at school celebrate the kids and what they're going through, and they'll tell them, focus on yourself more. Every emotion that you have must be validated and celebrated. The world tells us, focus on yourself even more. And as I see all these things unfold, I just want to bring something out, and I'm curious what your thoughts are. I don't think it's working. Do you think it's working? Like, what I'm discovering is the more people focus on themselves, it seems like the more depressed and confused they become about life. It just seems like people who are focusing on themselves more and more, and they're having more me time, they're having more vacation time, they're having more Netflix binge time. It seems like they come on the other side of that, and they're even more dry than when they went into that. I don't know about you and your friends and some of the discussions people are having, but I think one of the things we're noticing is that the more time people focus on themselves, the more depressed and confused they're becoming about life. We've even noticed it with a lot of kids in this generation. The kids that are being raised now have never been more celebrated and more loved, and yet a lot of the kids are growing up with a greater emotional struggles. And so I'm curious, what have you concluded about that? What do you think about all that? And so we're going to jump into that a little bit today. We're going to talk about what the Bible says, how we're supposed to react to some of these things. To prepare you for my talk today, I want to spend a little time briefly on how we got here. So in the beginning of this series called Redeemed and Forgiven, one of the things Sam and I really wanted to bring out was we need transformed. We need somebody, that would be God. We need someone to reach in our lives and do something for us that we can't do. We need rescued. We need saved. We need somebody, and that would be God, to reach into our lives and do something to transform us. And that's why we spent so much time talking about God and God's grace, something He's done and something He's inviting us into. God's grace is God's power that transforms us. And then the series moved from those few weeks and moved into, well, how do we take God's grace and live out this transformed life? Well, the first thing we said is we need to understand our lives aren't our own. It's a really important foundational point in understanding how you follow Christ. It's like we take the ownership card or the title card of our lives, we sign it, and we give it over to God and say, my life is yours now, and I'm here to follow you. And the second part about how we take God's grace and live out this transformed life, Sam really brought it to us. It's a whole conversation about how we need to desperately be connected to God. And Sam did such a great job that week. He brought out the Elijah story. Elijah did so many great things for God, and we find him in the story. He's tired, he's depressed, runs, and literally is in a cave and wants God to kill him. And Sam brought out the question that God had for Elijah, kind of the question God would have for us. The question is, so what are you doing here? Like, I need you back in the game. How did you get here? And Sam brought out, we desperately need to be connected to God. If we're not, we can potentially be all over the map emotionally, and God might show up and ask us, hey, how did you get here? So how do you take grace and live out this transformed life? Well, the foundation of it, obviously, is our lives aren't our own anymore. And the second part is we need to be desperately connected to God. And then lastly, one of the third things we wanted to bring up was we need to grow up spiritually. And what that really means is we need to be doing things on purpose that shape our hearts, not feed our egos. And so what are the things that we were talking about that help us grow up spiritually, help us shape our hearts? We talked about engaging God's grace. We give, we serve, we celebrate, we forgive, because those things shape our hearts. They don't feed our egos. And last week, Sam brought a message. It was such a great message. Talked about really integrity, what it means to be real. Jesus said this in Matthew 7:21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who has done the will of my Father who is in heaven. Jesus really makes it clear. It's the person who does the will of God. And Sam really brought this out last week when he said, actions come right out of who we are. It comes right out of our hearts. And you just can't hide this stuff. Who we are comes out. I like what he said last week when he said, who you are comes out, and everyone gets to see it, and everyone gets to experience it. You just can't hide this stuff. And his talk was really important. It was really important to understand what it means to walk through life with integrity and what it means to be real. And he closed with a great comment. He said, who you are matters. Who you are matters, because it's going to come out of you. So what do you do when we feel the avalanche of issues kind of moving in on us and we feel just overwhelmed with this stuff? I'm going to go right to scripture as we always do. It's in Philippians 2. It's Paul. He's writing the church in Philippi. I'm going to read this quickly. Is there any such thing as Christians cheering each other up? Do you love each other enough to want to help me? Does it mean anything to you that we are brothers in the Lord, sharing the same spirit? Are your hearts tender and sympathetic at all? Then make me truly happy by loving each other and agreeing wholeheartedly with each other, working together with one heart and mind and purpose. Paul's really pouring out his heart here to this church, and he's passionately writing them saying, listen, I need you to be unified. I need you to understand what it looks like to be unified. And the reason he was writing this is this church in particular was filled with a lot of diversity. There were rich people, there were poor people, there was Greek, Roman, and Jewish people. And what they could have done is they could have come to church and noticed the differences with each other, been selfish, and then ended up being very divided. But Paul writes them and says, no, you can't do this stuff. You have to be unified, right? And Paul's trying to help them see the big picture of what it means to walk together in unity. Love each other. The Holy Spirit that's inside you is also inside the other person, even though they look differently or maybe they're different financially. Like the Holy Spirit in you is the same Holy Spirit in them. And do you realize that connects you in a way? That means God's in both of you. You're like brothers and sisters now. And he's basically writing them and saying, listen, if God has made any impact in your life whatsoever, it's going to show up. You're going to be empathetic with one another. You're going to love one another. And really one of the clear markers of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus in spiritual maturity is the ability to walk with someone in unity, even though they might be different than you. So Paul writes to this church and he says, be unified. And that's great. But then how? Like, what's that look like, Paul? Well, Paul jumps right into verse 3, and this is what he says. Don't be selfish. Don't live to make a good impression on others. So what are you supposed to do? I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Don't be selfish. Don't think about yourself so much. Don't be so self-absorbed. Don't be fake. Don't try to work your way to the top of the organization by being fake and leveraging relationships. Don't focus on yourself so much that you don't know what's happening in the lives of people around you. This self-focus thing we call pride. And every time pride enters into the church or enters into the relationships, it destroys community. It destroys marriages. It destroys families. It destroys friendships. Pride destroys relationships, right? Okay, so Paul just wrote about what we're not supposed to do. What are we supposed to do? Well, Paul keeps writing, verse 3, this is what he says. He says, be humble, thinking of others as better than yourself. By the way, before I keep reading, do you do that? Do you walk through life and it's normal for you to think of others as better than yourself? That's a challenge for me. Verse 4, don't just think about your own affairs, but be interested in others too, in what they are doing. Paul says the answer to all this is be humble. And so let me ask you this, at home watching this, what's it mean to you? What is the mental picture in your mind of what it means to be humble? Do you have a mental picture? Maybe it's a quiet, mousy, kind, older grandmother baking cookies in the kitchen. Maybe that's your image of that's humility, right? It's not, but it might be a little bit. But let me ask you some other questions about this. Does being humble mean you're a wimp? No. Does being humble mean you're a doormat and you just allow people to walk all over you? No. Does being humble mean I never share my thoughts or my opinions? I'm just quiet. I'm in the corner. I never say anything? No. Does being humble mean that I put myself down all the time? No, that's not humility. If those things to you are signs of being humble, you might need to upgrade your understanding of what it means to be humble, and you might need a new mental picture on what it means to be humble. And later in this talk, I'm going to give you a great mental picture if you need that. To be humble means you have strength. To be humble means you have strength. You have the strength to take the focus off of yourself, and we would call that pride. You have the strength to take the focus off of yourself, and you begin to focus on others. You don't go inward, you go outward. And you walk through life and you realize people have incredible value. And Paul wrote, if it helps you, you walk through life and you realize and you think about other people and you say to yourself, they're more valuable than I am. If it helps you, do what Paul said. That is the definition of humility, right? So let me ask you a couple of questions. Do you think about yourself? A lot. We kind of all do. Do you feel the avalanche of issues kind of pouring in on you? And does it lead you to kind of loop in those mental loops and think about yourself a lot? Those avalanche of issues, do they leave you feel overwhelmed? Do they leave you feeling emotionally sad and depressed? And do you stay in those emotions and stay selfish because you're always thinking about yourself? Has it led you to kind of check out in life? And because you kind of walking through some stuff and you're just very inward about that, you feel like you're going to check out of life. Has it led you to continue to focus on yourself, loop in that and your feelings and your emotions? In relationships that struggle, there's probably a pride problem and a humility problem. What that means is there's probably one or two people who are really having a challenge because they're thinking about themselves more and more and more, and someone or both are not thinking about the other person more and more and more. Think about the relationships you're in right now. Maybe the relationships at church, at work, your friends, in the community, in your family. In almost every case that there is a relationship struggle, you're probably going to see some mix of a pride issue and a humility issue. Couple more questions. Do you consider anyone more important to you? Like, do you walk through the day and follow what Paul said and say, I consider people more importantly. That's the way I engage them. Do you treat others as more significant than you? For example, at church, at work, maybe your spouse, your family, your parents, your friend. Last question, do you walk through the day with pride, thinking these people bug me? They're there for me to get stuff from. Or do you kind of go through life differently and you think to yourself, I wonder what I can do to encourage and build others up today? How do you walk through life? So let's hit a time out, take a step back, look at the big picture of what Paul has been saying. What do you think about this? What do you think about this pride versus humility thing? Does it sound rough? Does it sound impossible? Does it sound insensitive? Paul's asking us to think about others and actually think about them as better than us. Does that even sound almost rude? Like he's not validating our emotions. Well, he keeps writing, and I want to pick up in verse 5. This is what he says. Your attitude should be the kind that was shown us by Christ, who, though he was God, did not demand to cling to his rights as God, but laid aside his mighty power and glory, taking the disguise of a slave and becoming like men. And he humbled himself even further, going so far as to actually die a criminal's death on the cross. If we need a role model to understand what humility looks like, it's Christ. If you need to upgrade your image of what humility looks like and have it in your brain to reference all the time, it's Christ. Because he took his eyes off of himself. He looked at the mess we're in. He engaged that mess. He took his strength and said, I'm going to go do something. I'm going to fix something. I'm going to serve them. You have to understand, what kept Christ on the cross wasn't his weakness. What kept Christ on that cross was his unbelievable strength. Humility has nothing to do with weakness. Humility is 100% about strength. The strength that says, I'm going to take the focus off of myself and I'm going to shift it onto other people. For you and I, maybe a modern day picture would be a father who goes through life and he wants to rearrange his priorities to engage his son or his daughter and have a relationship with them. Yeah, the father wants to go hunting. Yeah, the father wants to do different things, maybe, but he's going to sacrifice some of the things he enjoys because he's going to prioritize his son and daughter. That's humility. I'm going to take my strength and I'm going to engage my children. Same picture with a mom who just wants to love her children through all the stages of her life. There may be some things she wants to do, but she's willing to sacrifice those things to prioritize that relationship with her children. That's humility. It's the person who feels wounded or sad or depressed, and they want to go to God for a fresh touch of God's grace, and they want to take the focus off of themselves, and they want to put it back on God. That's humility. It's a group of people at every local church that says, let's gather together, let's pray, and let's invite our neighbors to church, and let's allow let's focus on building a place for other people so they can experience God's grace. That's humility. And remember, humility is strength. What kept Christ on that cross was his strength, wasn't his weakness. We're supposed to be like Jesus. How? You be humble. You have the strength not to be prideful and selfish. And we have to understand that image Paul was telling us about. Jesus was God, and he's in heaven. He didn't stay in heaven to cling to the perks. He didn't stay in heaven and demand that my life must be fair. He didn't take his status as God and say, this is my right and I'm not leaving. No, Jesus saw our mess. And he did not hit the reset button and wipe us out. He saw our mess. He engaged our mess. And he actually agreed to become human like us to help us. That's unbelievable. And to make matters worse, he even allowed sinful, selfish, hard-hearted people to humiliate him, beat him, and crucify him. That's unbelievable. Paul said, if you need a picture of what it looks like to walk through life in relationships, be like Jesus. Be humble like Jesus. Go over that story again and remember what Jesus has done for you. That humility is a picture of what it looks like to be an amazing disciple of Christ. Again, Christianity, it's not about power, spiritual power. It's not about knowledge, you can know everything about everything. It's not about that. It's not about what you accomplish. It's not about who you know. Again, the Christian faith is about love. It's how you love, humbly. Imagine a world that all they would experience from Christians would be humility. Imagine a family that all they experience from the parents is humility. Imagine a church filled with people who are humble. If you want to build unity in your community, if you want to build unity in your marriage, in your family, in your friendship, don't be selfish and prideful. Be humble. Now, before we move on, because I'm getting ready to close out here, before we move on, I need to disclose a couple things. Number one, as a disclaimer or something important I should bring up, to be clear, we're not suggesting that you allow people to abuse you physically. In the story in Philippians 2 that Paul wrote, the point of the story was Jesus was God, and he gave up the rights as God to come and serve us. And so if you find yourself in a physical, harmful relationship right now, don't stay in that relationship and think to yourself you're being humble. No, that's not what we're saying. And if you need more help with that, reach out to us or anybody who's responsible, and they'll help you through that. Number two, to be clear, when we talk about looking inward and being sad and depressed, we also realize there's some medical issues, right? So sometimes people can be walking through life and sometimes their family doctor can help them with that. We are pro-doctors, so understand that sometimes the medical community can help as well, and we obviously are very sensitive to that. Number three, to be clear, we're not saying you never think about yourself, right? It's okay to brush your teeth. It's okay to have a 401k. It's okay to think about what you're going to eat later on today. We're not saying you never think about yourself. What we're saying is don't be so self-absorbed you don't know what's going on in the life of people around you. Don't be so self-absorbed that you're stuck in this rut and routine and this misery, because all it's going to do is just going to absolutely ruin your heart, and it's going to ruin your ability to go through life, and it's going to ruin your ability to be in healthy relationships. Don't be so self-absorbed that you find yourself stuck in these moments. So I'm going to share kind of my big point and have some questions for you, and then I'm going to wrap up with like a mini story. My big point today is that when life begins to move in on you, this avalanche of issues and layer upon layer upon layer, like, oh my gosh, what's going to, and if this goes wrong, and if this goes wrong, and I got to take care of this, and I got to take care of that, as that avalanche kind of unfolds on you, it's going to probably leave you frozen, right? Tired, maybe a little depressed. My big point today is don't go inward and stay there. Don't go inward and stay there. Go outward. If you want to heal, if you want to have joy, if you want to pull yourself out of the mental looping that we tend to do, we're going to need to be like Jesus. We're going to need to not be selfish. We're going to need to be humble. You know, this is why so many people, especially around Thanksgiving, and they go serve. Now, serving on Thanksgiving is great, but if you talk to soup kitchens and people who are feeding the poor, the problem isn't trying to get people to serve on Thanksgiving. The problem is trying to get people to serve all the other days. My point in bringing all this up is it's whenever you serve people, it's whenever you take it, when you serve people, there's a joy that you won't discover in another way, because in those moments you're taking the focus off of yourself and you're serving them. So one of the reasons people serve is to truly help out, and that's awesome. Another reason people serve is when they walk away from those moments, they feel so much better. And this is what the whole talk is about today. When you feel like life is moving in and just kind of ruining you in some way, it's okay to take care of stuff, but don't go inward and stay there. You need to go outward. So let me ask you a few questions. Do you think about yourself a lot? Do you find that you're sad and depressed and kind of in a funk and you're just staying there and you have all the excuses as to why you can't get out of your funk, right? Do you consider anyone more important than you? Do you treat others as more significant? Maybe those at church, maybe your spouse, maybe your family, maybe those in the community or whatever sports club you're a part of. How do you treat your spouse and your family and your friends? Do you walk through the day thinking, man, these people annoy me. They're there for me to get stuff from, and they're just disappointing me? Or do you kind of walk through life and you think to yourself, these people around me, they're just as busted up as I am, and I'm just going to try to figure out how I can encourage them and build them up. Those around you, did you listen to them long enough to know really what's going on in their world? Can you even begin to wrap your mind around what God has done for us? Like this, He's God, and He left heaven to engage our mess, and it cost Him everything. It's hard for me to wrap my mind around that. Can you wrap your mind around that? Last question, then I have this mini story for you. What is your mental image of humility? To you, what is humility? What is that picture in your mind? I would encourage you, whatever it was, to upgrade it to seeing Jesus on that cross. He hung there for 6 hours, and He didn't do that because of weakness. He did that because of strength. Okay, so I'm going to tap out of this talk here. I'm going to share with you a mini story. And the reason I added this mini story was I'm hoping that I could give you something that you would grab onto and leave and never forget. I think the message of Christ is the greatest story I could ever share with you. I'm just going to share with you this other story, and I hope in a unique way it kind of sticks with you, right? So there's a story about a college professor who was giving his last exam to his kids. And the kids came in that day, and obviously they're very tired. They were very stressed because it's their final exam. It was really heavily weighted for their final grade. And they've been studying for hours, and so they're just kind of at wit's end, as anybody would be. So they sit down, they take out their pencils, and they open up the test booklet. And they were shocked because they only saw one question on that test. And the question on that test was, what is the name of the person who cleans this room? What is the name of the person who cleans this room? Some kids thought it was a joke, and some kids were furious because they wasted all this time to study, and this is the dumb question on the test. Well, the professor took the time whenever everyone calmed down, and he said, this is your lesson that I want you to never forget about. In life, you're going to meet a lot of people, and each one of them are very significant, and they deserve your time and your attention. And don't ever view yourself as more important than others. And understand you'll never be a success in life, truly a success in life, and until you learn what it means to be humble. This is the way Paul put it, and this is the way I'm going to close today. Be humble, thinking of others as better than yourselves. I hope this gives you handles as we walk into the holiday, Christmas, Thanksgiving season. We'll see you next week.